Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The presentation is about to begin. Elliot?
Why, thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Malkowitz, and welcome to today's webcast and panel discussion titled How to Take Control of Outside Counsel Rates in 2026, a very important topic. This event is brought to you by law.com and sponsored by PERSUIT. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some basic housekeeping items that may make your experience just a little bit more valuable. This event is completely interactive, and we do mean that. It features many customizable functions. So every window you currently see, and that's from the slide window to the Q&A panel, can either be enlarged or collapsed. So if you want to change the look and feel of your console, go right ahead and do so. If you have a question for our panelists today, please enter it in the Q&A field on your console. That widget is accessible on the left-hand side of your screen where you see the question mark icon. We will try to answer your questions either during the panel discussion or at the end of today's event. If we don't get to your question, you may receive an email response after the event, so don't let that stop you. There will also be some polling questions sprinkled throughout this event. Please take a few seconds to respond to those. It's very important that we hear from you. And finally, there are some valuable resources provided for you by our sponsor. If you go to the bottom right of your console, just remember, the more interactive you are, the more valuable of an experience this will be for you. Let's get to today's topic and really why you are here. Well, today's general counsel are witnessing the increase of outside counsel rates, with some global firms even pushing for double-digit increases across key markets. As a result, they are finding that traditional annual rate negotiations no longer deliver meaningful cost control. So to protect budgets and secure long-term value, legal teams must lead rate negotiations with clarity, discipline, and real market intelligence. So during today's webcast, you'll be presented with actual spend data to address key pain points such as why increases persist, the concentrations of inflation, and the gap between negotiation effort and financial impact. Very important to your practice. Now, here with us to discuss these issues are Maui Yavero. He's Legal Advisory Team Leader at PERSUIT. And we have Christine Baer. She's Director of Legal Operations at JLL. Take it away, Maui.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And first, I do want to thank Law.com and ALM for having us here today. And just a quick background about myself before I hand it over to Christine to also go over her background. My name is Maui Guevara. I'm the Director of Legal Advisory at PERSUIT. For those of you who are not aware of who PERSUIT is, we're essentially an outside counsel engagement platform where many of the world's most innovative corporate legal departments engage with their external counsel or law firms through our platform. The legal advisory team specifically sits as a strategic advisory function where we help partner and think through the strategies of how our clients can essentially optimize their outside counsel management programs. By way of background, I used to be on the law firm side of things. So I'm a reformed member of the outside counsel teams, but I'm here today joined by Christine. So please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Baer. I'm a Director of Legal Operations within JLL's Global Legal Operations team. We are a legal and compliance team of over 300 spread across 30 different countries, well, 30 plus countries, really. I've been at JLL for about 3 years. Prior to that, many, many moons ago, I was a paralegal in a law firm for about 4 years. And before this, I built a legal operations function at the University of Cambridge, so a much different scale of organization to the one I'm in now. I do want to add a little bit of context to my responses today, so I'm excited to talk about our rate review process, but it was not a solo effort. So what I'm sharing today and the responses I'm sharing today represent work done by our entire legal operations team and a lot of hands-on negotiation that was carried out by our executive director, Roseanne Heathcote, who couldn't be here today. So just really flagging that at the start. It is, as always, a team effort here.
Great. So just for today, I do want to take a look at essentially the 3 areas that we're going to be covering. So first, I want to give a high-level overview of the pricing landscape, and then we're going to hear from Christine about her actual experience of what it was that they were focused on coming into this rate negotiation season and what did they actually encounter. Then we'll talk about the primary way that most legal departments have been controlling their costs up to this point, which are discounts, and what the data is starting to show us about how this is potentially going to be a weakening lever and is already a weakening lever And then again, we'll touch on Christine's own experience here and how they thought about holistically the actual pricing engagements they have with their firms. Finally, those holistic strategies. So what are some of the things that clients, just like Christine, just like JLL, just like Rosen, are actually putting into place so that they can have a better understanding and better management of their relationships with outside counsel? So the first thing that I will start off with is actually a little bit of a quick poll. I'm interested here, and again, just select kind of the percentage ranges that you're in of what rate increases have you received up to this point, or are you expecting to receive from your outside counsel? We'll leave this up here for a few minutes, and maybe as a bit of a teaser, I'll ask Christine here, what is on average, kind of just high level, what were you seeing as a starting point from your firms?
Yeah, so as a starting point, and I should say we're not done actually with our rate review exercise yet. It is quite a time-consuming process, and I'm happy to speak, a little bit more shortly about the size of that exercise. But in terms of what we were initially seeing, I think the initial overall weighted percentage increase was about 12.3%. So that's like the initial proposal before we've gone back. I actually think once we corrected the current rates to match actual rates, it was closer to 18%.
All right, 18%. You're definitely at the top end of the market there. So I'd
like to be in that 0 to 5% in the poll.
Yeah.
So
it would be nice to be in that group. So let me push the results now of what we've seen so far. And yeah, I think it's going to be not surprising. We'll jump into the data here, but from what we're seeing, a very small amount essentially are getting those 0 to 5%. That essentially a flat increase coming into 2026. A majority of the respondents here are closer to 5 to 10, but a pretty significant portion are split between 10 to 15% plus. And then the 10% who haven't even started looking at it. I hope that by the end of today, you'll be motivated to really start to think about it and to have a little bit more preparedness for what might come going ahead. So just speaking about the broader market and what we were seeing across the firms. So in the US, essentially, clients through PERSUIT, when they had negotiated their 26, 27 rates, were getting a median of about 12.6%. If you look at it in the UK, it's closer to about 16%, and in the Europe, about 8.2%. So the big finding that we've found is that this is no longer unique. So many of you, if you've ever looked at your historical rate increases, you may have noticed that it was pretty closely tied to inflation there for a couple of years, particularly between the Great Recession and kind of COVID era. They were about 1 to maybe 2 even percentage points above inflation, the rate increases from law firms. So they were hovering 5 to 7% pretty consistently there. And then something happened that triggered during that COVID period. One, transactional work ramped up. And so there was so much demand for kind of these high value, high expertise partners. And that demand essentially led to an increase in rates for those premiums. Oftentimes, those rates for those partners were the ceiling at these firms. So a re-anchoring happened with the actual rates themselves. The other thing that happened during this time, and many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with at this point, is AI. And so the introduction of essentially ChatGPT shook the market a little bit, shook the industry, and a lot of firms took that as a signal, essentially with some forethought of, okay, we need to shore up our revenue model. And if you think about it, very basic terms, of course, there's other factors that contribute to it. But very basically, how a firm makes money is the hours of utilization, right? The number of hours that their people can work multiplied by the rate at which those folks can work. And so if hours potentially is going to be threatened, whether that's internal efficiency, so firms getting more efficient at doing the work, and client efficiencies, clients going out less to the firms because they can do more internally, then you have to offset that somewhere else. And the big strategy has been offsetting that on rates. So even, if you look at other reports out there in the industry around profitability in law firms and what's driving that, the single most impactful lever that they have is rate increases. And so that's really what's been happening in the last few years is they have been very aggressive and strategic around increasing the rates to re-anchor the market expectations and reset everybody to kind of not blink an eye nowadays when you see rates that are eye-watering. So we're seeing, 20% starting increases, but then dropping back again to those teen increases. You're seeing rates in the partner classes, counsel classes, even associate classes now in the 4 digits, essentially in the thousands of dollars. So that is kind of the current environment that we're in, right? It's aggressive increases, it's aggressive initial rates. And historically, there really has been no signal on the buyer side. So on the kind of client side, the corporate legal department side, that this strategy isn't working. So the firms haven't seen enough pushback from their perspective to change their mind on how their strategy is going to be with rate increases. The realization has stayed the same. So how much of the rate increases they're actually able to capture year over year, even though this year probably has been the most encouraging, in my view, of clients going back and actually having more thoughtful, data-driven conversations with their firms around these rate increases. So, Christine, I want to take a moment here to actually talk a little bit about your current rate process. I know you mentioned that you're still working through that and thinking through it a little bit, or still working through some of the stragglers. But interested to hear, what was the broader strategic vision for you guys, and what was the goal coming into this rate negotiation? And maybe you can give us a high-level overview of how you structured it.
Yeah, brilliant. And really interesting to hear all the points you just made, Maui, because they really resonate. And I think, some of my responses will tie into those themes of what you've seen. So this is actually the first time we've done an annual rate review cycle at JLL. It's part of a larger law firm engagement program that we launched last year. And the decision to launch that program was wholly driven by data that we presented to our legal executive committee. So, our vision really was to bring structure, control, and predictability to what had always been a decentralized ad hoc approvals process managed directly by our lawyers. So legal ops was not involved at all. Kind of really high level overview of how we got there. We presented an analysis of actual rate increases approved over the last 3 years and compared that to what our agreed approach and expectations were. So how many timekeepers were actually granted an increase? How much was that increase, not only in terms of percentage, but also real spend impact? Were increases being granted where we thought there was a freeze in place, because we didn't have governance and controls to manage that really. We looked at lots of other things, spend by law firm size, timekeeper classification, use of PERSUIT, and also market research into what our peers were doing and what programs they had in place. And the need for centralized oversight was really clear, through that data. And that really empowered us to kind of launch that program, part of which included the rate review. So, it's not about being difficult with firms. It's just about introducing some financial discipline and some management in there. And in terms of managing rates, our first step before the rate review was to immediately centralize those rate approvals through legal operations. And we are pulling in benchmarking data when we're approving those ad hoc rates as we approached that rate review cycle. We're now very much in the rate review cycle. And the way that we approached that was to move it from this kind of ad hoc individual rate requests throughout the year to an annual window, which I know is not a new concept, but it is new for us. And so it's a big step for us. And what that means is that, those substantive rate discussions are all condensed and consistent in terms of the approach. So we continue to require a 2-year lock on agreed rates, which we had required before. That gives us greater cost predictability and avoids constant renegotiation. But the process itself is pretty straightforward. So we sent a request out to our top 40 firms using the rate request functionality in PERSUIT, asking firms to submit rates for individual timekeepers who are currently doing work for us, as well as standard rate cards that would apply to any new timekeepers added during that 2-year period. We then reviewed those proposals against internal and external benchmarks and either accepted the rates or, provided a counter proposal. Once those rates were agreed, we then asked the firms to sign a master engagement letter, which covers the kind of, 2-year engagement and submit their rates in our e-billing system. So it sounds simple. In reality, obviously, that negotiation phase, especially across 40 firms, is incredibly time consuming.
No, definitely. I'm interested to hear if you have any metrics or even key insights on, what were the initial increases that you were seeing from your law firms? How far did you were able to drive some of those increases down to? Maybe you can even talk about what was the positioning that firms came in when they proposed these increases, right? Because I'm sure some of them were pretty significant and maybe had some sticker shock attached to them. So how were the firms explaining, the value proposition of these rate increases?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll start with the data points here. I mentioned one already earlier in terms of like that initial increase being at about 12.3%, but then when we corrected the firm's current rates, which is a learning I'll mention later, I think, it was actually 18% average increase on our current rates, which is significant. The good news is that the work we've done so far, and I say so far because we are only about halfway through, so I actually expect this to improve more, has reduced the overall weighted increase to 4.7%. It's also reduced the overall spend impact so far from over 1.1 million to about 500K. So, at this midway point, that's a huge success already. And I expect we'll see even more improvement there. We did, in terms of kind of outliers, we did receive requests for increases of 70, 80, 90%, even some over 100. We had a few firms ask for no increase or very limited increase, and one or two actually reduce their effective rates as a result of, the negotiation, but that's obviously few and far between. Yeah. I did pull a couple of examples, like on ones where we have concluded negotiations. I'm going to start with like our most successful one, because obviously that's the best use case to share. But so this firm's initial average increase across their standard rate card was 10%. We finished negotiations at -3%. So we actually achieved a 3% decrease on our effective rates with that firm. And so then for existing individual timekeepers, which is a separate kind of negotiation point, they'd requested an average increase of 16%. And we ended up at a total 1% average increase on our current rate. So like some pretty fantastic results there that I definitely do not take all the credit for. In one kind of more average case, I would say the average requested increase was 9.2%, and we ended up at 2.5% percentage average increase. So still, significantly dropped, but it's very case by case and firm by firm, right? Even timekeeper level by timekeeper level sometimes.
No, I'm super interested to dive into that actually and talk a little bit about, because many of the audience may have noticed at this point that we're not talking about discounts. We're focused on the increase, the actual impact on your organization and kind of your book at the end of the day and your finances. So really that's, I think, been one of the key things that I want to talk about here in this next section of how the focus on discounts actually is an ineffective way to have a conversation with your law firms around these increases. Before I do that, though, there is a question that I think we can just answer now here in the question section is, if you have some delay in setting your 2026 rates, how are you applying that to existing work that's happening in 2026 already? So work that they're already doing, but potentially you're still negotiating the rates or the invoices. What's been the approach for JLL there?
It's a great question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because it is a huge gray area. We had expected to have wrapped up the negotiations sooner than we did. And so we have come into that kind of gray area where the expected effective date of rates is now going to be backdated. So really, we're just approaching that with firms on an individual basis. And when we engage them, for example, through an RFP and PERSUIT, we're letting them know that we expect that to be billed at whatever rates are ultimately agreed through the rate review process.
Yeah. And then just from some broader industry context as well, that approach is actually completely up to you as an organization of what makes the most sense. There's not typically an industry norm. There is an industry expectation from the perspective of what the firm wants. The firm will always want to backdate it. to the beginning of the year, essentially, to get the better rates, or the rates that they've now potentially negotiated with you. What I actually advise clients and customers to do, and this is the next section that we're talking about, right, is strategies and tools that you can deploy in these rate negotiations. That can be just another lever for you to utilize when you're having these discussions with your firm. So it's not necessarily a free giveaway that you can just give to firms. I think you can agree in concept to be able to backdate it, but you should get something in return for that. That it is a benefit for the firms to essentially get a backdating on their rates. So that's an additional nugget that you can essentially keep and have when you're having these conversations with the firms. So I have a poll up right now that just talks high level about some of the benchmarking that you use and utilize when you're having these discussions with your firms. Interested to hear from the audience if they're using any today to have these data-driven conversations, right? We're going to talk about now as discounts and how the discounts is becoming a weakening lever in this next section. But I'm also interested to hear, even in the increased conversation we have in the first section, what are the kind of key metrics, outside counsel, KPIs that you might be using? And then Christine, maybe you can share a few of the ones that your team used. I know you mentioned just high level, you had some external and internal benchmarks. Anything specific that you kind of want to highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. So we used a kind of funnel approach when benchmarking, and we had a number of benchmarks at our disposal. So first, external benchmarks that included data from PERSUIT as well as from our e-billing system that provides kind of broader insights than just our spend. And then we also looked at our actual spend, including drilling down by location and practice area. And so when we were negotiating, we kind of first relied on those external benchmarks if we could for that initial conversation. If we were able to agree rates at that stage on the basis of those benchmarks, great. If the negotiations were more difficult, then we would pull on those, kind of actual rates paid to date, both for that particular firm, but also for comparable rates for similar firms in the same location and practice area to kind of leverage that real spend data.
Yeah. And just quickly over the results here, super interesting that the number one is relying on historical data only. I think that oftentimes it can be very tempting to just do this because it is going to be the most reliable. It's one that it's one that applies to the work that you have, but missing that external component, that market component, really can leave you behind a little bit, so to speak, because you don't have a broader sense of how your bench of firms are operating outside of your own ecosystem. So oftentimes, talking about discounts becoming a weakening lever, we hear all the time when we have conversations with corporate legal departments that, hey, my discounts are actually great. I'm getting 15%. I'm getting 20% from my law firms. Without the full context that is the market norm. That's the industry average. Firms expect and anticipate when they go out to market that they are going to have to give within, around 15 to 25% discount off of their rates. They really are aiming for 80% realization. And then when you look at the data, there's industry reports out there like Thomson Reuters State of the Legal Industry Report. They actually report on the realization percentage of law firms. And that's essentially been hovering at 90% for almost 20 years at this point. And so what that tells you is that on average, the discounts that they provide their clients is around 10%, 15%. And the other thing that discount percentages hide really is that once you stick to this discount percentage, it will never grow at the same rate as the increases, right? So if you think about it, you're still absorbing the increased percentage unless your discount percentage is also growing. And I don't know if any clients who can kind of really say that most of their firms are at a 40% discount with them or 50% discount with them. At the end of the year, if you're focused on that discount as a primary lever, you're really missing the underlying factor that drives your costs, which is essentially the increase. And so, again, just touching back on the kind of language and terminology that Christine was using around increases and their focus on increases, I think that's really, really key as you think about what is actually impactful and what's actually useful. when it comes to negotiating with your firms. So just a couple of factors. Oh, here we go. We go back one to this one. Oh, where did we go? Yes. Am I in the slide with the, Christine, are you able to see the slides?
Yeah, I think it's the managing rates is not managing cost slide.
Oh, okay. Why is this one? Oh, I see. It's animated. So just going through and talking about some of the things that we always have conversations with our customers and clients on. One, again, rate increases, single most effective lever for revenue for law firms. So they're always going to tie back to that. Then there's the compounding issue, right? It's 5% this year, it's 7%, 17% next year, it's 12%, 5%. If you look at the underlying rate, it's always going up. So regardless of what discount you're going to get, it's anchoring increasingly at a higher and higher rate. An additional thing, and there's a question in the audience about this, about alternatives to this billing structure, is that rates inherently run counter to efficiency, right? The most that a firm is going to make and are profitable is if they have a ton of hours and those hours are charged at high rates. And so the maximum economic benefits is only realized when they get the most realization from the rates and the most hours per head count, essentially. And so there is a little bit of a misaligned incentive there when you're focusing in on rates. Rates also ignore other valuable work and other value propositions from the work. And I'm interested to dive into this with Christine here around, what other value propositions and what other value conversations did she have and Rosen have with their firms to get to those really successful outcomes and get to those percentage increases. And then finally, the consolidation in the rate market, where, again, all of your firms, essentially, it's cost of doing business to be providing 15%, 20% discounts. But just talking about, specifically with JLL's experience here again, when you were going through and having these rate negotiations, what was the most kind of effective line, or what did you focus on when you were having conversations with your firms?
Yeah, so I think, going back to what you've already highlighted, we were focused on the actual increase, not on the discount. The discount is like a byproduct. We do have actually a firm where we've concluded negotiations already where it is above a 40% discount. So it does exist. That's, again, not the norm necessarily, but we do have some that are up there. So I think, that combined with the data is really where we came in. And I do want to say just a little bit more on that kind of discount model, because I think, we had some firms attempt to push that standard rate with discount model, which is just really them unilaterally resetting the baseline, right, every year. And we did not accept that. And I would really like to kind of put a plea out there for in-house teams not to accept that. It's us accepting that continues to perpetuate that to, or continues to allow that to exist, right? If we push back on that standard model, it will discontinue. So, I think it's particularly true of top tier firms with specialized expertise. Maui, you mentioned that earlier with those ceilings. That's where it's been most stubborn, but our strategy has been really consistent across all firms. And that's really the approach we've taken, is to anchor our baseline to current agreed fees, not to whatever their current standard rates are.
Yeah, super interesting question here, actually, from the audience. So the reality is, right, like that's still a tough conversation to be had with your firms, I'm sure, because they're going to come back to you and say, hey, we're now 30% off of our rack rates. We're now 40% off of our rack rates if we give you rates like this. So how did you, what were some of the tactics or conversations, or maybe what was some of the approach that you took to really ground those law firms back to talking about increases versus, wherever their rack rates were set?
Yeah, again, I think I'm not saying that we ignored them completely when they said that, but again, we just refocused on, okay, but this is this percent increase from our current agreed rates, right? That's our focus. Our focus isn't on how much of a discount this is from your current rate. Our focus is on how much of an increase this is from what we're currently paying for the same work you're going to be doing for us. And we just, circle it around back to that every time. And we're asking them to justify, for example, in some cases, like 167% increase. How can we justify that internally? And how can you justify that to us? It's really, it's difficult for them to be able to do that. We did ask firms to justify any increases. And, it's mostly third-party kind of survey data saying that, yes, they're increasing, but they're below market, or, there's rising talent acquisition and retention costs and technology investment. That's great, but that's also true for us, right? We have technology investment as in-house clients as well. So, I think really just bringing it back around and having the data, I think having the data is the critical thing. That's really what has enabled us to be successful here. For example, on that current rates point that I mentioned, when we put this request out to our firms, they filled in their current rates and the new proposed rates. That's how the increase is calculated. When we audited those current rates against the actual current approved rates in our e-billing system, 75% of the firms had not put the correct current rates. They had put rates that were higher, which obviously obscures the actual cost of those increases and the actual percentage of those increases. So without that data, we wouldn't have been able to negotiate confidently in the way that we did. Did we lose Maui?
He is coming back on.
Yeah. Apologies for that. That was weird. There we go. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I think we just cut off at the audit of the rates. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. It's really having that data to hand that has enabled us to negotiate. In the strong position that we have. And the firms don't tend to have that data to hand, is what we found in our negotiations. I mean, they must have it in their systems, but when they come to those discussions, they don't have the, kind of client specific rates and the effective dates readily available. So when we have that data to provide it to them, it puts us on the front foot.
Yeah. And I want to dive into that interesting point that you mentioned there around actually having the firms justify the value of the increase, right? I think that is something that I want to definitely highlight to the audience here today, is when you're having your conversations with your firm, simply accepting the fact that, everybody else is pricing this here or our costs are increasing, that's great. But what is your focus as a customer and a client? I think that often gets understated in conversations with the law firms. And you need to have them understand that from your perspective, there has to be a requisite increase in the value that you're receiving to justify some of that increase. Sure, just like any other business, costs borne by the service provider have to be essentially baked into the price of the service that they're offering. But I don't see any other businesses out there increasing double digits every single year arbitrarily, right? I don't see anybody re-anchoring higher and prior prices that beats inflation 2 times, 3 times at this point and consistently. And then you balance that out with, the news that, the Kirklands of the world are the first law firm to reach $10 billion in revenue, profits per equity partner of $11 million. And so where is that being borne? And that's being borne on the fees that customers and clients pay into those firms. And so, yes, it's a business model and they run a really great business model. And so I always tell customers and clients is don't be shy with negotiating and having conversations with your firm, because they are savvy. They have teams, they know what they're doing. And so it's, now is the time to actually be engaged in these conversations and not feeling like a captive market or a little bit of a captive audience. You do have power and buying power. And as Christine mentioned before, the more of corporate legal departments do this and push back and actually have these conversations with their firms, the stronger the signal is going to be for their firms or for these firms to rethink the pricing model. I think there's a question here in the Q&A that talked about what are the alternatives? There's many alternatives out there today, but one of the reasons that things like AFAs, alternative fee agreements, value-based pricing haven't really taken off is that the law firms and the clients point at each other and said, you first, you tell me if you want to do this. And the law firm says, well, the clients aren't asking for it. And then the clients turn back around and said, well, the law firms aren't offering it. Someone has to start it. And I think at this point, with the advent of AI in particular, the clients, corporate legal departments are in a really, really good place to actually lead this conversation.
And I think, Maui, I would just add one point there, which is that if you don't ask, you don't get. So, if you don't do this exercise, or if you don't reach out to your firm and ask about negotiating rates, you're obviously not going to make any headway. We managed to negotiate down even with top tier firms where our internal lawyers were like, you're not going to make any headway with this firm. It is worth having the conversation and pushing back. The data gives you the kind of like confidence to do that in a fact-based way, where you're not just saying, well, this seems too high. You can really justify this is too high.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the other point is that's a great point you just made there of you don't know until you ask. Like many of our clients have never even asked or even started a conversation to see. They just have this thinking or thought that the law firms are an immovable object. So I want to touch on some questions here that might be a little bit more technical, just to see how you guys approached it. How did you approach progression and promotions for your associates? So increases that came about because they jumped from third year to fourth year this year.
Yeah, so the approach we took to that is that we will allow adjustments for that during the rate review cycle, but not in between. So for that 2-year rate freeze, those rates are frozen, and we don't allow increases even for promotions. That is something that not all firms, are thrilled with, as you might expect. And it is a point, in some of the negotiations that we're having, but that's the approach we've taken.
Yeah. So again, similar to the lever, right, of utilizing backdating invoices for rates, this is an additional lever that you actually have in your conversations with law firms. So don't give it for free. Don't just say yes, have your progressions. You can take the stance similar to JLL that it's a no from the starting point. And if it's going to be a yes, you have to give us something, an additional concession on rates, an additional value proposition or pricing structure that is beneficial or advantageous to us. Like all of these little factors and components should be part of your conversation, which ties us in very well to the next piece, which is what are some of the holistic strategies that other corporate legal departments, JLL, use to really control costs, really drive value with their firms. So I'm going to start off with just a quick high level, kind of opinion poll of what are some of the cost control levers that your departments are using today. And then before jumping into that, there's one last interesting question that, I want to chime in on. And if you have any thoughts on this, Christine, as well, would welcome your thoughts. But what or how much buying power do smaller legal departments have? So if you have very limited to small legal department budget, how much buying power do you really have? What I will say here is that you would be surprised. Oftentimes, partners are actually measured independently for their book of business, right? Like when a law firm looks at their book of business, yes, they look at it overall from a larger company, but many of these partners also independently manage, look at, monitor, and try to grow their book of business. And so you have that relationship with that partner to have the conversation of what is possible and what can be there. I think many of these relationships, or many of these negotiations, again, go back to the relationships. And I'm not advocating to remove or alienate that relationship that you have with your law firms. You should maintain that. And you should just make sure that whatever your conversation is, it's backed by data, backed by information. So wallet share relative to your spend is just as important as the actual, dollar value of the spend itself. So telling a law firm that like, hey, we rely on you, you're top 5 in our bench, you get a huge component of our wallet share, we want to continue working with you, but this becomes untenable for us. Not to say that we're going to walk away, but at these rates, at these price points, we're ultimately gonna, it's gonna be a hard decision to keep sending work your way. So that's, things like that focus on the broader financial relationship, the kind of context around these rates can be super, super impactful, even if you have kind of potentially a smaller budget. And then, not sure if you have any thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I think it does impact things. It also impacts your internal prioritization when you're making decisions about kind of where to give during negotiations. You might take into account the amount of usage or spend that you have with the firm. So on the internal side, it's a factor. On the external side, though, in terms of like your negotiation power, it is definitely, an element there that you'll need to take into account. We did ask our firms in our rate review cycle to identify like what percentage of their overall, revenue that our work represents. Now, not all of the firms answered that question, but we figured again, don't ask, don't get. And, I know that does come into their decision-making, right, around the pricing that they will give us. We did have one firm who, to be honest, I think we weren't enough of their revenue share and they weren't really interested in playing ball as a result. But again, okay, maybe we consolidate our spend and we move that spend elsewhere. Or if the firm is not engaging with us, again, I think no matter how much spend you have with the firm, you should be able to have these conversations and get fair market rates. So if that firm is not playing ball, then you should consider moving to a different firm that is at least willing to come to the table and have a conversation.
Yeah. And ultimately, that's a great point. Now you have the data. So even if you decide and make a choice and, then that becomes an evaluation, that maybe your department has to make, where you say, hey, look at this firm. They are 20%, 30% above the market. Is the risk that we're offloading to them, is the work that we're offloading to them, is the expertise that we're relying on them on worth the 20% differential of anywhere else in the market that we can look at, or our bench of firms? But without having that conversation, without asking, you don't know, right? You don't have that data to actually have those really thoughtful conversations internally as an organization. So that's part of the relationship building, is just the financial kind of aspects that you have with your firm. So just looking at the primary cost control levers here, no surprise, rate negotiations, rate discounts, the biggest ones here, outside counsel guidelines, invoice reviews, and then some AFAs and some panels sprinkled in there. I think what is interesting to me whenever I look at this is that a lot of this is very kind of almost reactive, right? Like you're reacting to the rate increases that the firms are going to come. Outside counsel guidelines is really ring fencing. And then you have to go back and actually make sure that they followed your outside counsel guidelines. Invoice reviews are the same thing. But one of the things that I do want to talk about today, and some of the strategies I want to talk about, is a little bit more proactive. So what are some of the more modern outside counsel management programs using and doing to be more holistic around their cost management? And we did get a couple questions around these today, around alternative fee pricing structures, alternative fee arrangements, and alternative pricing structures. So super interesting data point here from PERSUIT. We looked at the body of work, similar bodies of work, so similar litigation, similar transactions. How much did rates rise over a period of time? And then for similar work that was actually priced on an AFA basis, so fixed fee, how much did those prices rise? And the thing that we hear about AFAs all the time is that, hey, they're still ultimately based on hourly. They're going to grow at the same rate. But that's not what the data shows. So the data actually shows that it's a 3x differential between the growth of the hourly rate and the growth of the fixed fees. Now, how is that possible? Because AFAs, again, incentivize the right behavior. The bigger message that I want to get to here is aligning with your firms on the right behavior that you want from them. And AFA being one of the more powerful tools that you have, alternative pricing structures, the more powerful tools that you have to do this. So fixed fees, firms get rewarded the more efficient they are, right? So if they solve a problem for you, if they resolve a risk, if they are able to close a transaction that much more efficient, that much more quickly, and with that much more expertise and experience, and they bring all of that to bear, the more efficient they are, the bigger their margin is on that matter. That's kind of a little bit of an unsaid thing about fixed fees, is that the better the firm actually does at managing that work and the lower they come under that fixed fee, the larger the margin is on their end. But even when you compare the actual price differential between those fixed fee numbers and the hourly rates, you're still going to be better off than just doing an hourly rate structure. So not to say that the foundation of hourly billing is going to disappear. I think there's always going to be some remnant of it. Is it going to be the primary or strongest factor going forward? I don't think so. But I think that corporate legal departments need to start thinking about how can they structure their pricing a little bit differently, whether that's portfolio-based pricing, matter level scoping and matter level pricing. If it's looking at retainer models, if it's looking at bundling some of the work, fee menus even that has taken off now in the IP space, for example. There's all of these structures that you can start to think about and have conversations with your firm. And rate negotiation time is the perfect time to actually have these conversations, because you can show them and you can essentially present to them that, hey, we are feeling these fee pressures. And ultimately, hourly rates are going to hit a point where it becomes unworkable for us internally. And we understand that you might have to increase rates. So what are the alternatives that we have where we can show kind of a cost increase mitigation on our end, but still make it advantageous, profitable, good for our relationship between you, law firm, and us, client. Another thing, too, that is kind of trending now in corporate legal departments is purposeful allocation of work. So really right sourcing where all of your work is going to. Should it be going to these top firms, to your most expensive firm? Should it be going to your number one firm just because your GC or AGC may have had a relationship at that law firm? Is that the right structure or strategy to do it? And then just focus on driving rates for that firm, for example. We don't think so. And I think the data supports us here. If you look at similar matters across the AM law, for example, what is the price differential between an AM law top 50 firm and the second 50? It's a 99% price differential. And this is for the same matter, right? Like we bundled kind of the same characteristics of matters here when looking at price differentials. You look at it between the 50 and the next 100, and it's 158%. And now it's almost 2 times differential when you look at an even smaller firm. So being really purposeful in thinking about how you're allocating and assigning this work can be super advantageous for you. And then I'll just cover 2 more quick things, and kind of I want to talk to Christine about their maturity, where they are, and how they're thinking about cost controls. But the last 2 things that I do want to show is competition. Competition drives cost savings. So having your firms compete for your work is valuable in 2 ways. One, you get a better understanding of what is market value for the work that you have. And 2, you instill in your firms that it's not a guarantee. Your volume is not a guarantee. That they do still have to partner with you, align with you, be engaged and involved when they're getting the work. It's no longer just a blanket assumption that work and volume is going to move to these firms. And it's a stark differential, right? Like when we look at our firms, this first, the gray bar that you see there, are firms or our clients who essentially only ever sent their work to a single firm, and then they negotiated with that firm. When we look at the data, they're able to negotiate prices down. They average about 7.5%. Now, when you look at those customers and corporate legal departments that send their work to at least 2 or more firms, and then have those firms compete and then use that data to negotiate with their selected firm, they're able to get a differential of 46% on average to the market price. So there's a clear distinction here, there's a clear advantage here of really market testing the pricing, even if it's just rates, but AFAs in particular is super, super important there. I want to pivot here and now just talk about JLL specifically. So in your own kind of cost and financial management maturity journey, where is JLL today? What's kind of in the roadmap next in terms of controlling costs? What's next on the agenda once you're done essentially with your rate negotiations?
Yeah, so top of mind is definitely wrapping up that rate review cycle. Yeah. And I was going to say, that I think we're still really in the early stages of our maturity journey. But to be honest, based on the slides and the data you've just presented, we are actively looking at and implementing measures across all of those. So maybe we're not so early in our maturity journey as I feel like we are. We're working as part of that broader law firm engagement program that we launched. The rate review cycle is just one element of it. The rest of it is around really kind of governance and cost controls and spend management. So a couple of other things that we've introduced is that we now require a competitive RFP with reverse auction to be run through PERSUIT for all matters that are expected to exceed $50,000. And the savings that you just showed on that slide are representative of the savings that we see, when we run matters through PERSUIT. And we do see an additional drop when we run that reverse auction. And I think, we see initially with lawyers who haven't used it, some hesitancy that they think the law firms are not going to engage with this, or that it might be, detrimental to the relationship. And really, it isn't. It's not stopping you from choosing that firm, as long as that firm is the right choice for that matter and is presenting you with the best value, right? That doesn't always mean the cheapest. It might mean that you need to pay extra for that expertise. So that's been really well received and really great in terms of AFAs as well, and driving that kind of structure around scoping. Because that process has all of that built in, it naturally comes through. I think we have maybe 90% of the RFPs we run through PERSUIT are AFAs. Usually capped fees, because we are still, again, on that maturity journey as we move maybe toward fixed fees or more kind of value-based arrangements. But that's one element, that's driving better scoping and cost predictability, right, throughout the course of that matter, something that we can really hold the firms to. Under that threshold, we've introduced kind of matter level scoping requirements and budget requirements. And we're also running trainings internally on matter scoping, as well as that budget management throughout the life of the matter to kind of help improve those skills. And I will say, we're maybe only 6 months now into the introduction of that program, but I am already seeing us work through and improve on some of those points, today. Yeah. We are also looking at right sourcing. So I wish I would have had this deck when we did our data analysis. But what we found was exactly the same. That price differential is significant. So we're looking at that as part of our broader strategy. We've recently presented data internally with industry benchmarks for comparison against, where we're spending with firms over a certain size or top tier firms. How does that compare? Do we need to be doing that? Because, the increase in cost versus a smaller firm who might be just as capable of doing the work is significant.
Yeah. And I want to touch back too on, again, making this a point that ultimately, yes, you still have to have relationships with your firms. And so I have some interesting questions here around performance bonuses, or maybe even just monitoring performance, how well firms do for you. Is that something that JLL is thinking about or potentially planning about, of, running? We hear sometimes quarterly business reviews or even annual business reviews with our law firms. Can you speak to that? I think
that's an area where that's kind of our next level maturity. Once we have these kind of cost controls and governance in place, we do give firms some feedback, but it's not we don't have a consistent requirement. We really want to kind of nail down these basics before we then move on to what we then see as a kind of next level. But we typically don't, at the moment in our RFPs, have a kind of success. And that may just be the type of matters that we're dealing with.
No, 100%. I think if you zoom out to like the broader market here, the broader industry, yes, that is on the furthest out on the maturity level, like the maturity scale. I think there are organizations out there that do this really, really well. And they have structures that it's actually in the pricing structure to say, hey, we have holdbacks or we have additional discounts that will trigger based off of success criteria. So if they meet, SLA requirements, if they meet AFA percentage requirements, that type of thing. And you can have, again, it goes back to having the conversation with your firm to see what they're willing to work with you on. I know that we only have a couple minutes left here, so I might just turn it back to the audience and to see if there's any questions that we'll want to talk through or talk about. Okay, so I like this one. Maybe, Christine, you can talk more about what were some of the factors and considerations that you had in your negotiation that you used to, have the conversation with the firm, particularly maybe some of the ones that gave you, negative growth or really successful ones. What were the levers that you pulled on? What were some of the gives, some of the requirements that you had in those conversations?
Again, I think primarily, our negotiation strategy really was focused on that data. And so in some cases, we were asking a firm to maybe come down from its current rate on the basis of benchmark data. And I think that might be an unusual thing. I'm not sure that most in-house teams are doing that, and I give Roseanne full credit for that one. But, we really took this as an opportunity to really step back and assess, not just the increase from our current rates, but is the rate we're paying now the right one? And how does that compare to benchmarks? And any rate increase requests that we get in now, at any point, although now we're requiring them to be annual, obviously, but only for our top 40 firms. So this is a program that we're going to have to expand over time. So for firms outside of that, we are benchmarking those as well, and pushing back and asking them to reduce if we think that is fair and market.
Yeah. And, just to give the audience a sense of other things that other organizations have used or leveraged, for example, volume discounts. So you could make it a requirement to be an approved firm to have at least the basic volume discount structure. And then that's an additional lever, right? If they come in without a volume discount structure, okay, we need a concession on the rates. Additional value.
Actually, Maui.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go.
I didn't think about volume discounts, and there is an additional complexity there as well. So for some of the firms, where it might look like we only have a 0% discount or a small discount on standard rates, sometimes that's because we have a volume discount, and some of those are effective from the first dollar spent, which is effectively a discount on standard rates, but just a more complicated one to kind of capture in reporting.
Yeah. But those are exactly the kind of financial considerations that you should be thinking about, right? Like, what are the things that we find valuable and could be helpful for us getting aligned on sending work to this firm through volume discounts, pre-built, fixed fee and portfolio structures, value-added services, different things like that. Okay, so final question before we close out today. And I do see the questions in the chat. If there's any that is interested in having further conversations with PERSUIT or asking about the data, most of the data that you saw today should be in the outside counsel report link that you're seeing on the screen here. If you have any additional questions, please just type yes in the Q&A. We'll get that information and then we'll reach back out to you and continue the discussion. And any of this material will be available afterwards. So kind of final question is really key takeaways for you as you're coming towards the end of this process. What's kind of, the one lesson that you might want to impart, another counterpart that you have out there?
Yeah, I think the biggest enabler of our success here was having that data readily available and at our fingertips. We had a couple of firms that were part of this cycle who had, majority of their billing outside our e-billing cycle or our e-billing system, for example. And the difference was it was a stark difference between how well we could negotiate with them versus the other firms, because we just didn't have the same baseline data. We couldn't challenge the current rates, so you are in a much, much better position if you are capturing that data and relying on that data in your negotiations. It's very difficult for the firms to argue with facts.
Yeah. And then my only add-on there is you have to start somewhere. So if you don't have that data, then this process should be where you start that off. So thank you. And I'm going to hand it back over to Elliot to close us out.
Great job, folks. Really important topic. Thank you, Maui and Christine, for your time, your insights, and for sharing all that data. Also, thank you to PERSUIT for sponsoring this event. To the audience, if anyone is interested in learning more about PERSUIT, just type yes in the Q&A panel right there, and somebody will get back to you. We do have your email. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope it was useful to you. If you missed any part of this presentation, remember it will be archived shortly at law.com, so you can view it again, or you can refer someone to it. And while you're on that page, we encourage you to also explore other upcoming and on-demand presentations that may be valuable to you. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon, everybody.